In today's Irish Readathon video, we're talking about rereading. So I recently did a video where I picked some books off my shelves that I wanted to reread. I'm not really someone that makes much time for rereading. I feel like I get caught up focused on like all of the unread books on my shelves and don't really focus on returning to books that I have previously known and loved. And when I initially started planning that video, when I went to my bookshelves to take a look at picking some books off my shelves that I wanted to reread, I found myself immediately drawn to Irish writers. So I decided to split things out and do a specific video in addition to the one I've previously done, specifically focused on Irish writers that I would like to reread. What I really enjoyed about that initial video as well was it was kind of a bit of like a reading journey discussion, because I had quite strong memories of reading those books and like memories associated with them and reasons I wanted to return to them. I'm hoping I'm going to have similar with running through these Irish specific books. I've only got the books that I have on my shelves here. I have a lot of Irish books that I have loved over the years on my shelves at my mother's house, but I don't have access to those ones right now, so I'm going to focus on the ones that I do have to hand. And I have 3 books here by Louise O'Neill, but to be honest, this applies across the board to all of her books. Almost Love and After the Silence are 2 books that I don't have with me that I definitely want to reread. But in terms of these ones that I've got here, the first Louise O'Neill book I ever read was Only Ever Yours. And this is a young adult dystopian. And I would kind of describe it as like The Handmaid's Tale for teens. I think I was probably about 18 or 19 when I read this. And the themes of, I suppose, kind of like patriarchy and pressure on young women to perform femininity in a certain way and look a certain way are themes that I've gone on to continue reading about into my adulthood. I remember thinking this was so brilliant when I read it, so I'd be intrigued to return to it and see if me, like 10 years later, still finds this one as impactful. And at a really similar time, I read Asking for It by Louise O'Neill. Depending on who you talk to, some people consider this a young adult book, some people consider it an adult book. This cover that I've got here definitely leans more towards the adult demographic. And this is one that I have reread previously. I do think I've maybe read this book about 3 or 4 times, but not in recent years. I think the last time I would have read it was maybe like 2017. This is really specifically about misogyny and rape culture. It's an incredibly emotional, hard-hitting one. It's about slut-shaming, it is about revenge porn. And I think one of the things that she captures so brilliantly in this book is presenting the specifically Irish nuances in how those things manifest. You can see here that I've put loads of sticky tabs in it from previous reads, and it was one that I used a lot as a resource when I was at university. When I was writing myself a lot about these kinds of themes, I found this a really valuable book to use as a source. It's definitely one that I would like to return to one day. As I said, After the Silence and Almost Love are 2 books that I would definitely like to reread as well. And I think in particular, I think I'd get a lot out of reading Almost Love, because I felt like when I read that book, I felt like it really particularly resonated with a lot of things I was feeling myself in my personal life at that time. And I would be intrigued to reread it and see how that connection and resonance has evolved over the years. And then I'm pretty sure Idle is her most recent book. This one I don't feel necessarily the same level of pull to reread. It's not one that I felt the same level of kind of personal resonance that I'd felt with some of her previous books. But I would definitely like to reread this nonetheless, because Louise O'Neill is honestly just like my favorite writer. Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is another one of my like favorite books of all time. I have read it, I think 2 or 3 times. 3 times. The first time I read it, I found it so impactful. I felt like it really resonated with me. It was at a time in my life when I had just moved to London, and I really associate that initial read with beginning to build a sense of community in London and connecting with other readers who had read this and enjoyed it. And then the TV show came out, I was even more obsessed. And I really associate the rereading experience of this with the pandemic. I was doing so much reading during that time in my life because I didn't have anything else going on really. And I have really strong memories of one reading experience just being like really cozy in my bed. I had a really cozy reading setup at that time. I was back in Ireland and was turning to books that I loved for a lot of comfort. And then the second rereading experience, I remember being sat in my mother's back garden, reading it cover to cover in one sitting when it was so hot outside. I'm sure you might remember that 2020 summer, it was so hot. And I literally just read it cover to cover while sat outside. And I think this is one that will always stand up to rereading for me, but it has been several years since I've done that. And then Tender by Belinda McKeown is one that I really recommend for fans of normal people that are looking for something else. And I also think if you enjoyed The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue, we'll talk about her in a minute, then you would really get on with this one as well. This is set in Dublin in the 90s, and it follows two young people, Catherine and James, who have a very intense and intimate friendship. And the novel really explores themes of miscommunication that you might recognize from normal people, and the blurred lines between kind of love and obsession and friendship. And it really captures, I think, so much of what I've heard about Dublin in the 90s. I've never reread this one, and I think while I remember absolutely loving it and it being such a strong recommendation, and I know it was a 5-star read for me, some of the details have now become quite hazy. I think I read this maybe in 2019, so I'd really like to return to it to kind of cement it as a favorite book. And then finally, I want to talk about Promising Young Women by Caroline O'Donoghue. So this was her debut novel. I read it in 2020, and again, it has such a strong position in my memory as being one of those books that I read during the lockdowns and absolutely adoring it. And I think this was one of the first books that I read during that time period, and having such a strong 5-star read during that time was something that, I don't know, just really helped carry me through a really difficult time. This definitely falls into the category of books that I really love, that is kind of young woman figuring her shit out. It's about Jane, who is in her 20s. She's kind of adrift, and she ends up entering into a relationship with her much older and married boss. And it's about the interplay between sex and power. It explores what it's like to become someone's dirty little secret and how that can impact your life more broadly in your friendships, in your sense of self, your sense of self-worth and self-esteem. I remember this book just being completely brilliant, and I've gone on to read absolutely everything that Caroline O'Donoghue has written, whether it's her adult books or her young adult books. It makes me really happy that so many more people have her writing on their radar after The Rachel Incident. So if you enjoyed that book and you haven't visited her backlist yet, I would really recommend it. This is another one where I definitely remember it being a 5-star read and being completely brilliant, but because I haven't revisited it, some of those details have become quite hazy over the past 5 years. So I think to cement it as a favorite book, it needs to have those reread experiences. So that is it. They are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. Are there any books that you have read that you would really like to reread? Specifically, I'd love to hear about Irish books since we are in the midst of the Irish Readathon. Is there anything that you have read as part of that readathon over the years that you would love to revisit? Let me know down in the comments. And as ever with the Irish Readathon, if you don't have anything in particular to say, but you'd like to let me know that you are here, leave me your favourite green emoji to celebrate the readathon. That's it for me today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.